Greetings, all! Today, we are going to take a special look at the rock type and analyze its attributes, the Pokémon assigned to the type, and how it functions from a combative standpoint. While it might be seen as a type that is easy to overcome in the right circumstances, hence why it is a common type to see in early gyms, the rock type is a brutal type that can easily use pure brute strength and blunt force trauma to bludgeon opponents into submission and leave them badly beaten and bruised at the very least. The Pokémon assigned to the type might be known more for their defenses than anything else, but for the few that have strong offenses to match, these brutes can prove to be a pain in battle, as there are very few types that can actively resist damage from the type. You might have some trouble overcoming the lack of special offenses and often vulnerable special defenses, but when it comes to using solid, rock-hard defenses to form a wall that few basic Pokémon can overcome, the rock type is one that has withstood the test of time and can more than be put to good use by those that know what the type is truly capable of in a fight. The rock type is one of only two types that are primarily defined by the presence of some specific type of armor. In this case, it is rocky armor. Pokémon in possession of rocky armor tend to eat rocks and other high mineral content materials and then break them down, excreting the resultant produce from pores in their body as a solution of no more than 5 to 15% water, the material moving out sluggishly and hardening shortly after coming into contact with the air to form a tight seal that keeps their inner forms protected against attack. This type of armor is very sturdy on its own and is great for resisting basic attacks from normal types, among a few others, but it is not impenetrable, as the crystalline structure of these shells makes them susceptible to weathering and erosion, leaving them vulnerable to grass and water type assaults, as well as attacks that can break through the armor forcefully or otherwise shake it to pieces. Even so, the rock type is one that emphasizes defense over most other factors, and the Pokémon in possession of rocky armor tend to have better defense than most, alongside the steel type, and can thus prove to be incredibly powerful and dangerous to take on without extremely strong offenses on one side. As far as what the type can do in battle, the vast majority of rock-type attacks are physical in nature, and involve the use of rocks as their primary method of delivering damage, whether it ranges from simply throwing rocks at others to striking with sharpened rock shards of some sort and beyond. These types of attacks deal damage through immense blunt force trauma, the hallmark-defining feature of rock-type damage, and thus can prove to be very effective against opponents with otherwise brittle body forms. On the other hand, though, there are a few rock-type special attacks which utilize abnormal energy fields to deal damage. These energetic attacks may be few and far between, but they match the damage capabilities of physical rock-type attacks and are thus classified as such, even if their abnormal energy nature makes them difficult to understand completely. Due to the specialized anatomy needed to generate rocky armor, the type is fairly exclusive among a select number of different types of organisms, with only a few outliers to note. The two most dominant categories for this type are creatures whose body is mostly made out of rock to begin with, and fossil Pokémon, who all possess rock-like outer skin and hide due to a corruption in the DNA restoration process responsible for bringing them back to life in the first place. Still, there is some variation to this, but in almost all cases, the Pokémon that are defined under the type all have rocky skin and hide outside of these two major categories, and are thus well armored against the basic attacks of others, even if their bodies are still highly vulnerable to a number of different types and might not always grant them access to a large number of useful and powerful rock-type attacks. As far as move variety goes, the rock type is in an interesting position, as the Pokémon comprising it are mainly split into two major groups. On the one hand, those that learn a lot of different types of rock-type moves tend to be very limited in the degree of what other attacking types they can work with. As such, while they specialize well in the type and make good use of its best offenses in time, there is very little going for them elsewhere, with the normal and ground types, and occasionally the steel type, often being quite common among the Pokémon in this group. On the other hand, those that do not get much in the way of rock-type offenses, despite being assigned to the type, tend to demonstrate a tremendous degree of move variety naturally and through artificial means, and can thus be among the most versatile of Pokémon in their class. There is only a little bit of overlap between these two categories, so for trainers to make the most of the type, they will either have to hone in on those few exceptions, or pick a side and stick with it, though this does little to deflate the otherwise impressive offensive power some rock types can possess. In terms of stat averages, the rock type is definitely one that is all about physical attributes, and while everything else might be subpar, the type can still make the most of what its stats do provide it to work with. Looking at their weaknesses, rock-type Pokémon tend to lack much in the way of mobility as a result of their great weight and bulky armor, weighing them down and making their speed stat the lowest one on average. This bulky armor also takes a toll on their bodies over long periods of time in weighing them down, so their overall stamina is fairly poor. Most importantly, however, their special offenses and resistance against the special offenses of others tend to be on the lower side, their rocky bodies being more susceptible to energy-based attacks that can at least partially penetrate their outer armor. Overall, this means that the type's base HP, special attack, special defense, and speed stats are below average compared to other types. Thankfully, what the type lacks in these categories it makes up for in physical might, as the type's base attack and especially defense stats, the latter of which being their best stat, are above average compared to other types, and can more than make them physical juggernauts that can take and deal physical damage quite well. As such, the type is one that really requires careful usage in battle to make the most of these strengths and weaknesses, and while there are some odd exceptions to the rule, if you plan on using Pokémon of the type, make sure to use them as physical walls and physical offensive sweepers, as that is where their best traits tend to shine through the most. Currently, there are 60 recognized types of Rock-type Pokémon, 11 of them being pure Rock types, and the remaining 49 being Dual types, not including Alolan Geodude, Alolan Graveler, and Alolan Golem. Additionally, 35 of the Dual types are primary Rock types, while the remaining 14 are secondary Rock types. They are broken down into the following categories. Animated Stone. These Pokémon are unified by the fact that a substantial portion of their bodies are made out of stone and not living tissue, leading some to consider them to be non-living in the most extreme of cases. While many of these creatures do have a limited amount of organic tissue inside of them, some, like the members of the Roggenrola family and Regirock, completely lack organic tissue and are animated by other forces, such as nuclear energy in the case of the former and electricity in the case of the latter. Regardless of their physical form, these creatures generally all have very high physical defenses and have the capacity to learn some of the strongest rock-type attacks available to Pokémon of the type, even if their natural move variety, in terms of attacking types, tends to be very limited. Mammals and mammal-like. These Pokémon are unified by the fact that they are mammals, or at the very least, are very mammal-like in their overall biology. These creatures are noted for their impressive defenses and powerful offenses, and are different from other rock types for their unique access to a variety of different attacking types, both naturally and artificially, giving them a leg up on other Pokémon of their type. They also tend to be the easiest to work with at a young age, and can prove to be valuable partners to rely on, though they are held back in that only a few of them are fast enough to deliver the first strike in a battle. Crustaceans. These Pokémon are unified by the fact that they are all crustaceans, though their general forms differ substantially from one another. The members of the Dwebble family are different from similar crustaceans in that they lack a water-type assignment completely and prefer to hide their vulnerable bodies inside of stone shells that they carve themselves, and while their offenses are only mildly strong at best, they still have imposing physical defenses and can more than wreak a little havoc with their Rock Wrecker attack. The members of the Binacle family, on the other hand, are a step above normal barnacles for their incredible intelligence and capacity to work together as a whole to survive in the wild. While different members have different personalities and have been known to fight each other, when working together, they can use devastating attacks like Cross Chop and Skull Bash to great effect, and ultimately prove to be more naturally versatile than most other rock types could ever hope to be. Oceanic organisms. These Pokémon are unified by the fact that they dwell in the water as part of their natural habitat of choice, and while Corsola and Relicanth are otherwise worlds apart, despite both preferring to live in warm tropical waters for the most part, their rocky skin helps to define them both under the specifications of the rock type. Corsola are fairly simple animals that rely on their coral growing on their bodies to survive, and while adorable, they are sadly poorly equipped for serious combat, though their coral branches are often valued as trinkets when discarded naturally. Relicanth, on the other hand, are living fossils that have remained mostly unchanged biologically for millions of years, and are noted not only for their extreme rarity, but also their rocky scales, which grant them incredible physical defenses and make them one of the few Pokémon capable of having access to both the Head Smash attack and the Rock Head ability, meaning that they can use the devastating attack without taking any recoil damage at all in the right circumstances. Fossil Pokémon. These Pokémon are all unified by the fact that they represent the few species of ancient Pokémon that have been successfully cloned from genetic fragments encased in rare Lagerstadt deposits. In nearly all cases, all genetic material is destroyed in the fossilization process, as any and all organic materials are substituted for rock material. Every so often, however, a rare fragment of genetic material may be preserved within the interior of a fossil. Most of the time, it is too degraded to use, but if there is enough material for scientists to at least logically guess their way through, it can have the missing components filled in and restored, in turn making it possible to replicate the DNA and bring an ancient form of life back into existence. As a result of the way this process operates, all fossil species are almost guaranteed to not be exactly the way they once were, as the substituted pieces used to fill in missing genetic sections are only logical guesses and not the true arrangement that should be present. However, all of these species still act and work biologically as their true ancestors likely did, giving us a brief window into what past life was like in person. Unfortunately for most, as a side effect of the fossilization process, the sections of DNA that determine the skin textures of these creatures are mutated and distorted from the cloning process, leading all species to automatically produce and possess rock-like skin, and in turn leaving them vulnerable to the same offenses true rock types are weak against. Reptiles. This special category is reserved for the members of the Larvitar family, whose thick, scaly hides are quite sturdy and possess the same basic properties as rocky armor, hence their classification under the type. Even at a young age, these creatures can learn attacks like Rock Slide that put other young rock-type Pokémon to shame, and their physical power only continues to grow as they evolve from Larvitar to Pupitar, becoming the strongest cocoon Pokémon in the world, before ultimately transforming into the devastating Tyranitar, one of the most powerful, non-legendary Pokémon known. These brutish creatures are capable of incredible destruction and are more than worth fearing under normal circumstances, with opponents that otherwise have a type advantage still at the mercy of their awe-inspiring physical power and rugged defenses. Thermophilic bacteria. This special category is reserved for Magcargo, who are defined as rock types by the large shell of cooled lava that sits on their back. These creatures are, in truth, little more than Slugma, who have grown in size and had part of their body cool, squishing their backside to push up their front and granting them a slightly different appearance. The shell on them is fairly brittle, but otherwise surprisingly strong and can reform very quickly, and while it can be broken and torn off in many cases, Magcargo can regenerate the shell very easily and thus make themselves tough cookies to crumble without super effective attacks on one side. Mold. This special category is reserved for Shuckle, and unique they are indeed, for these creatures are effectively sentient pieces of mold living in shells that they craft themselves. Because their bodies are ordinarily very soft and yield easily to pressure, these creatures need a proper way to defend themselves, and so use their unique chemical acids to dissolve rocks and coat their outsides in crystallized acid that makes their otherwise hollow shells incredibly durable and almost impossible to break with conventional tools. Their offensive stats, stamina, and movement speeds might be atrociously low, but these creatures are practically unparalleled in their defensive might, and with the highest defensive stats out of all known Pokémon, tied in only a few cases with some Mega Evolved Pokémon, it can definitely be said that anyone trying to crack them open is going to find the task near impossible if they can't get a direct hit on a Shuckle's soft body. Subspace Dweller. This special category is reserved for Minior, abnormal life forms that occupy the uppermost reaches of the Earth's atmosphere, though still ultimately being of terrestrial origin. These creatures are generally defined by the rocky outer shell that protects their core, which acts as the source of their rock-type attributes and helps to grant them impressive defenses as a whole. However, this rocky shell is quite brittle, and if it sustains too much damage, it will break, exposing the core of these creatures to attack. This results in a massive drop in their defensive stats, but it also heavily increases their offensive stats and agility, making them powerful fighters that can make good use of their freedom to deal critical damage to a target before they are ultimately knocked out. Ultra Beasts. This special category is reserved for Nihilego and Stakataka, two of the extra-universal entities known as the Ultra Beasts. Although these creatures are both classified as rock types, the structure of their bodies differs substantially in form, and they possess their own unique attributes that help to highlight their connection to the type. When Nihilego appear to have relatively soft bodies, the membrane that forms their physical body is made out of a glass-like substance and has bizarre textural and physical characteristics that do not match that of any other known living tissue or man-made glassy material, though it does vaguely match that of certain shock-sensitive materials. In particular, when the membrane is struck by an attack, it tends to stiffen for a very brief moment, with the glass-like substance within it hardening into a solid sheet, allowing it to resist damage from basic attacks, but leave it vulnerable to moves that can break through the armor. It also seems to actually dissolve in the presence of water and plant-based energies, and it additionally resists damage from flying, fire, and especially poison-type attacks as a result of the membrane's unique molecular structure. As a result of these observations, and because their bodies react to elemental damage in the same way rocky armor would, they are thusly classified as being partial rock types. In comparison to Nihilego, Stakataka's assignment as a rock type is much more obvious, as their bodies are made from an organic stone-like material that grants them incredible defenses and makes them almost impenetrable, made even more so by the additional layer of metal that armors the outer edges of each individual life unit comprising the creatures. In looking at the rock type's advantages and disadvantages in battle, in terms of offense, the rock type has 4 advantages, 3 disadvantages, and no negative immunities. The type is at an advantage against the flying type because, while the bodies of many flying types might be able to sustain damage from most types of physical strikes, the sheer amount of blunt force trauma involved in many rock-type moves, along with the abnormal energy fields emitted by the few rock-type special attacks known, is enough to break their otherwise frail or fragile bodies, smashing bones and muscles and making it very difficult for flying types to protect themselves against their impact. The type is at an advantage against the bug type because the bodies of these creatures must remain fairly light in order for them to move around at decent speeds and maintain flight in the cases of those that can fly, and their bodies in general are not built to be able to handle extreme blunt force trauma. Even a small stone can deal noticeable damage to these creatures, leaving many bug types vulnerable to the crushing power of rock type attacks, even more so if they are also partial flying types and have their wings crushed in the process, grounding them and leaving them vulnerable to further assaults without a way to defend themselves. The type is at an advantage against the fire type because fire types often have volatile chemicals stored in their body that are used either as the fuel source for or the cause of ignition. In their case, while these chemicals are normally unaffected by psychic type attacks in comparison to the volatiles contained within poison types, due to differing chemical properties and resultant purposes, the severe impact from blunt force attacks delivered by rock-type moves, as well in general the abnormal energy contained in rock-type special attacks, can forcefully cause these chemicals to mix when they shouldn't internally or otherwise ignite them prematurely from sudden physical shock, causing severe internal damage and in turn increasing the overall amount of damage the attacks can do against fire types. The type is at an advantage against the ice type because, while the bodies of ice-type Pokemon can sometimes be sturdy, the crystalline nature of ice means that there are lattice points along which it can be cleaved, and with enough force, icy armor and bodies in general can be severely hurt in the process. The blunt force trauma associated with rock-type attacks and the unique energy used in rock-type special attacks is more than enough to deal critical damage to Pokemon with bodies partially or made completely out of ice by exploiting this flaw, in turn dealing severe damage to them and potentially causing irreparable damage in rare cases. The type is at a disadvantage against the fighting type because, in addition to being designed primarily for the purpose of breaking through things like rocky armor, the bodies of fighting types are built to be tough and resistant against severe blunt force trauma and can resist the effects of certain types of energy-based attacks associated with the rock type, granting them a noticeable resistance against damage from them. The type is at a disadvantage against the ground type because ground types typically have some sort of natural, thick hide or skin that is able to flex and more easily absorb kinetic impacts from blunt force attacks. Since rock-type physical attacks are designed to use powerful blunt force strikes to deliver bone-crushing blows, this resistant outer hide helps to reduce the damage dealt by these types of attacks in the process. As far as special attacks go, the outer skin of these same Pokemon tend to be able to reflect the abnormal energy waves used in rock-type special attacks, helping to reduce the damage dealt overall by said blows. Lastly, the type is at a disadvantage against the steel type because metallic armor, which is designed to be able to absorb kinetic energy delivered from basic strikes without armor-breaking capabilities, is able to do so quite readily with the energy delivered through rock-type attacks, absorbing the energy delivered through these blunt force trauma-oriented strikes and diffusing it readily across a wide area, minimizing the damage these otherwise brutal attacks can normally do to unarmored opponents. Defensively speaking, the rock type has 4 resistances, 5 weaknesses, and no immunities. The type is resistant against the normal type because normal type attacks, lacking elemental characteristics and the ability to readily deal armor-breaking strikes, are unable to bypass the defenses provided by most types of rocky armor, and thus end up dealing less damage to those in possession of rocky armor as a result. The armor providing a useful sink against kinetic energy imparted against it and being able to reflect the high-frequency, light-based energy derived from normal type sources of power. The type is resistant against the flying type because, much as with the normal type, the flying type's reliance on direct contact or wind without fundamental armor-breaking capabilities does little to penetrate the rocky armor possessed by rock-type Pokemon, and is thus unable to always readily overcome them as a damage buffer. The type is resistant against the poison type because rocky armor is generally solid and much less porous than normal skin and hide, only being broken down readily by the physical and the chemical actions of elements such as water. Without a way for poison to easily seep into the internal systems of these Pokemon, the type's overall impact is reduced, and the damaging power of its associated attacks is in turn severely hampered. The type is resistant against the fire type because the hard and rocky bodies of many of the Pokemon assigned to the type are built to be able to handle extreme heat very well, oftentimes because their bodies are tempered against such extremes, as well as pressure extremes, from living deep below the surface of the planet. While metal might readily melt at high temperatures, at worst, rock will become slightly soft under the same level of heat, but rapid cooling can return the material to a more natural state, leaving the target only a little worse for the wearer. As such, Pokemon in possession of rocky armor of some sort are able to better withstand the damage from attacks that involve extremely high temperatures, weakening the impact of fire-type attacks as a result. The type is weak against the fighting type because of the primary nature of the fighting type, namely its capacity to break through armor by imparting enough of an impulse to cause the armor to buckle and shatter internally. This applies especially in the case of rocky armor, whose inflexible nature makes it susceptible to damage from these kinds of strikes, in turn allowing fighting type attacks to penetrate and bust through armor of this type. The type is weak against the grass type because the vast majority of grass type Pokemon are designed to be able to use roots or some other natural body part to wedge their bodies into the ground, even to the point of cracking apart bedrock as they embed themselves into its surface. This same ability can be used on rock-type Pokemon, as their bodies are often primed for these sorts of processes to be able to break through their rocky outer frames, shoving their bodies into cracks and crevices and using their grass-type powers to split the armor apart. This further applies to energy-based grass-type attacks, as the natural energies can break down the rocky hide or armor of rock-type Pokemon and in turn deal severe damage to them. The type is weak against the ground type because rocky armor in general tends to be relatively inflexible, so when great shearing stress is delivered to said armor, it usually has little ability to maintain its form. The vibrational effects of moves like Magnitude and Earthquake in turn can help to shake apart this armor, while projectile attacks can help use mud to abrade away the rocky armor of rock-type Pokemon and compromise it, in turn working to severely weaken the opposition and leave them highly vulnerable to further attacks. The type is weak against the water type because water has the ability to chemically break down rocky armor quite readily, with even the weakest of moves having the potential to crack apart rocky armor if delivered at high velocities. Normally, this wouldn't necessarily be a huge problem, as the insides of Pokemon that are otherwise weak to the type can usually handle the damage dealt without serious issues. But because some types of Pokemon are comprised almost entirely or even entirely out of rock, these attacks have the potential to wear away at their insides and deal severe internal damage, making it one of the rock type's biggest weaknesses to have to worry about. Lastly, the type is weak against the steel type because, although rocky armor is incredibly sturdy against most types of basic physical assaults, physical attacks of the steel type, delivered with limbs that are coated in some sort of metal, have the ability to pierce through rocky armor, cracking it apart as it bypasses these defensive barriers and digging deep into the opposing target of a steel type attack, helping to not only deal consistent damage, but reduce the effectiveness of the armor itself, as every piercing blow compromises its effectiveness as a stable shield across the opposition's body. Steel-type special attacks, while derived from light energy, as with many normal-type special attacks, are at a lower frequency and thus have the ability to cause exceptionally minute vibrational damage that allows the light to pierce through rocky armor much as ground-type attacks can, dealing severe damage to the bodies of rock types in the process. As far as using the rock type in battle goes, the type is one that is common to see among beginning trainers and more advanced trainers, but is generally lost among trainers of intermediate experience because of the awkward usability of the type between the start of one's journey and the very end of it. While the rock type is one that is able to take quite a physical beating, the Pokemon that are a part of it are often lacking in the way of special defense and thus are highly susceptible to these sorts of assaults, which is something that is made even worse by the fact that they have many different weaknesses, the type's weaknesses to the grass and water types being especially noteworthy in this regard. Many rock-type Pokemon do not even have ready access to any attacks of their type at a young age, and thus are unable to make good use of it right away, placing them at a disadvantage compared to other types of Pokemon. They also tend to be of below-average intelligence in many cases, and can be hard to train as a result, requiring a level of strategy and expertise that is usually only accessible to trainers that have a great deal of experience in working with them. The Pokemon assigned to the type are further held back by either their limited access to different types of moves, sometimes primarily being limited to rock, ground, steel, and normal type attacks, or by their inability to learn much in the way of useful rock type attacks. But this is an issue that can be at least partially mitigated through artificial processes, or be used to spectacular effect by overpowering the opposition with sheer brute force. Despite their limitations, young rock-type Pokemon tend to be great for younger trainers as their strong physical defenses provide a useful barrier against other young Pokemon that are limited to basic attacks for offense, and the fact that very few types actually resist damage from the type can make them powerful weapons to use in more advanced settings that can easily pummel weaker opponents to dust. Because of the type's unique properties in this regard then, the type lends itself to both defensive and offensive strategies, and a mixture of the two can often produce fantastic results and allow these Pokemon to hit hard while still being able to take damage themselves, making well-trained rock types tough cookies to crumble. The rock type might be seen as a joke to some, and a type only younger trainers will truly struggle with, but in the hands of someone that knows how to bring out the type's best traits, the rock type is a brutal force to be reckoned with, and one that can literally bury the opposition under a heap of stone when used expertly and make a lasting impact that the torn flesh and broken bones of opponents will readily display to all that doubt the type's power. Thank you all for watching this video. It is always an honor to be able to speak with you all on the subject of Pokemon in a way that brings me great joy and happiness in my work. If you would like to keep tabs on past and future work, click that subscribe button, check out my work on DeviantArt, and don't be shy about following me on Twitter, where you can find pertinent announcements on upcoming work before it is officially posted. Links to both can be found in the video description. If you would like to support my work and help Miguel and I continue to produce more content for you and improve upon our presentation, please visit us at my Patreon page, which you can also find a link to in the video description. With that, I thank you for watching and I wish you well.